All the hottest takes from the last 3 weeks. That's what we're talking about today. On Stealing Bananas return, I'm Ben Gretch. You can find my newsletter. Man, it's been a while since I've done this. Find Stealing Signals newsletter at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. And you can find all of his fantastic work at RotoViz. Continued to write while on his vacation. Shawn, not everything went swimmingly on the vacation, but sounds like it was a good opportunity to see another part of the world. I know all the listeners are glad you're back. Got a lot of feedback. A lot of people wanted us to be figuring out. I mean, they just missed the show, and certainly, the stuff that you hear when you're a content creator is you should just do it consistently any way you can. But I got a lot of stuff that's like, have a guest host or figure something out. Give us something to listen to. But this show started, Shawn, as you and me being like, look, we're two friends that have these long, fun football conversations, and we'll just record them and let people listen to them. It wouldn't have been the same trying to do anything while you were out away. So we took a little break. We are back. And that's the way that it is. We're back now, and we talked for over 2 hours before we hit record today. But how are you doing? How was the trip? How was everything?
Good. It's nice to be back. Never going on vacation again, Ben. No, I'm kidding. But one of the things you and I talked about, one of the reasons why I kind of set up this way, this was, by my recollection at least, the first time that I took more than a day away from the site since like 2018. So that's a while back.
Yeah.
But did do some articles. You and I obviously didn't. Our schedules, when I'm on a different continent, didn't fit well to do the show. But obviously, we were in contact. We were enjoying. Ben, one of the best parts actually of the travels was to watch our teams. They went pretty close to unbeaten during that stretch. And obviously, it's just a couple of weeks, but we have more than one roster together. And that part of the season and kind of where we are now with the season, it's just interesting because you often get a pretty good sense of where you're going to be after a couple of weeks. And the first couple of weeks didn't go particularly well, at very least for me. I think kind of for us, where you have the J.K. Dobbins injury, you have the Aaron Rodgers injury, which hurts both Garrett Wilson and Breece Hall, two guys we were very high on. And then at least on my side of it, there are some breakout guys that I was very excited about who didn't hit early. And so when you have some of those guys feathered into your teams, that part is also tough. And yet, and sometimes that's the way the season goes, right? This year, there's been such a fun progression and development and different times, turns. And I was even joking in my intro earlier this week about, the double-edged sword of best ball, and both the agony and sometimes the thrill is you can't cut your misses. And so when a Trey McBride does what he's done recently, you may have cut him off of all your redraft teams or too many of them, but he's still on all of those best ball rosters. And so you get to watch how that works. Ben, one of the developments recently, one of the things that was just so devastating too, was you get that little bit of a rough start, but you have Devon Achane and such a high roster exposure there that he had pulled a big chunk of Best Ball Mania teams into what, would be a winning position after the first month to 5 games. And so there's the excitement, then he gets hurt. And you're like, man, it just, when are these guys going to stay healthy? The players have started to hit at such a rate that my BBM3 advance rate is higher now than when he went out. And obviously some of his particular teams have fallen out, but you're excited to maybe get him back at some point to pull him through, that maybe you're going to have more rosters with him in it than, some other HN owners, because, those teams you'll have to compete with later. That part has all been very, very exciting. But yeah, so fun to travel. Great to spend some time with family, get to see the Oracle at Delphi. That sort of a once in a lifetime thing. Get to see the Parthenon there at the Acropolis, get to take an evening cruise along the Bosporus and see all of those amazing sights there on the river in Istanbul. Even with some of the things that we're less fortunate that we won't go into here. Yeah, I just so grateful for family, so grateful for the fantasy community, so grateful for, being born into a really lucky life, because one of the things that, we do see with world events is that many people are not. And so anyway, just come back to the show with a lot of gratefulness and so excited to be back with you. I mean, best friends is what life is about. And those couple hours just chatting were wonderful. Ben, you've been knee deep in this as we go through. What are we seeing now in fantasy football here? What are the big stories Christian McCaffrey having an extraordinary season. Travis Etienne somehow doing it every week, despite the fact that the Jaguars mostly are not putting him in the best situations. And yet, man, one of the things, we hear all the time is, oh, this guy's going to be working as a receiver. This guy's going to be split out wide. So this guy's going to do this, that, other thing. And you're like, well, when it gets to the actual season, no, he is not. And yet we see a 50-yard touchdown pass to Travis Etienne that, number one, allowed the Jaguars to kind of pull away in this game. Number two, you get a 50-yard touchdown reception to your running back. And we saw this also with Breece Hall, a very different type of play. But Breece Hall, the yards per route, is kind of extraordinary. You look at his route numbers versus Bijan and where they are actually scoring points as receivers. That contrast is interesting. But Etienne did it with some air yards. This is kind of what we're hoping to see from him and Trevor Lawrence. I mean, the Jaguars have been very good, but it's been a little bit of the same kind of story that we've gotten with the Kansas City Chiefs this year. I mean, the Chiefs don't have a Travis Etienne by any stretch, but both of those teams kind of doing it with defense. And yet, if you're thinking with the Jaguars of them being kind of this stealth Super Bowl candidate, I mean, Etienne needs to make some of these plays. Trevor Lawrence, I mean, that throw was a great throw, and especially when you're not quite getting what you really probably want from Calvin Ridley. You've got these multiple guys in the passing game, and yet the passing offense is not explosive. This is one of the signature plays of the year for me.
That's a great play. You asked kind of what's going on. I think I want to go back to what you were saying, and obviously great to have you back and everything you mentioned. So cool to get the opportunity to do those things. You mentioned our teams have done very, very well. I just want to update the listeners on that. We have 5 teams in the FFPC main event. This is just one example. It's what I pulled up while you're talking. You mentioned to me that our advance rate on some of the underdog teams that we did has moved up, and we have a few in advanced position right now, which is nice. I've seen some other stuff where we have still some other stuff straggling around that teams are in good spots. But I think the core of what we do is the FFPC main event stuff. And I know we've talked with the listeners a lot about these teams in the past. They're probably wondering when we're actually going to win something. We have 5 teams. They are in first place, third place, fourth place, and fifth place across their 5 divisions at the moment. The team in fifth is only 5 points behind the team in first in that division. It's one that had more points against, but is actually the third highest scoring of our 5 teams. So it's not our lowest scoring team or anything. It's a strong team. They are all 5 strong teams. And so I say all this, what I'm about to say, I guess from that position. I'm certainly not trying to brag or what have you, but if there's a question of like, how are we at where we at? Like what we've kind of missed on is the build up for a couple of weeks of like, yeah, our portfolio looks fantastic right now, and talking through as it's gotten better. And so I think there's a lot of stuff we could discuss in terms of where we're at in fantasy football right now, about how we are where we are. The first thing I want to emphasize is you talked about us doing well in these last few weeks. You have talked about, for as long as I've known you, that the way that we draft, the intent is to crush when the bye weeks hit. We want to have strength through the starting lineup into the bench. It's something that I have re-communicated. I don't know. I can't think of the word. To my subscribers at Stealing Signals. I've bought into this for many, many years. And I initially really bought into it from your, analysis and teachings and what have you, things that you've written over the many years. But the idea has always been depth and strength beyond the starting lineup, beyond what feels like during your draft is enough, have way more than enough firepower, because stuff happens in season. And I think it's more evident than ever. I wrote about this in an intro in Stealing Signals over the last couple of weeks, but with the season having gotten longer and the health stuff we've talked over the last couple of years, where players, I think teams are a little more cautious with players. I think they're a little more cautious in any given game because it is a little bit of a longer season now, and they have a little bit of a longer view than when, I was learning how to play fantasy football and you were early in your fantasy football years 15, 20 years ago, when everything was like you were do or die every Sunday. If you were active, you were playing through broken ribs. And I don't think there's as much of that in the NFL. These guys are still warriors. I'm not trying to minimize it, but I don't think there's as much of that in the NFL today. And it's good for the players, frankly. I think it's the right approach. But in terms of the impact on fantasy football, you have more players, I think, missing time. More, let's get this guy right. We talked a little bit, I think, before you went about Justin Jefferson getting put on IR, and I was talking about, I thought that was a cautionary IR, and that has played out that way. It seems like they just put him on IR because they're like, we're gonna not have a conversation every week about him being eligible. We're gonna put him on the shelf for 4 weeks, and I do think he'll probably be back next week based on everything that we've heard throughout. That kind of a thing where it's like, we have a long season, like we're not going to push you and have you put, like, we're going to set expectations. You're going to miss 4 games. IR it is. And the fact that the IR is only 4 weeks now, I mean, we see that used a ton. As we're recording this right now, I mentioned to you in the pre-show that there was a note that came across, on my phone, a notification that Darren Waller might be the next guy to go on, because he kind of re-injured his hamstring this weekend. Okay, we'll put you on the shelf for 4 weeks. I mean, that's those types of things, right? So I clearly have made that point, but there's more need for depth and for the ability to put a guy on your bench and rotate other players in. You talked about Achane, for example, a great option for some rosters early and hopefully late. But in this time in between, you need something else, right? Because he's been on IR for a few weeks. And that's exactly what, and it's like I love it when a plan comes together thing, because that's what the whole draft strategy has been about, is the bye week crushing. And we've been doing that. The week that you left, Shawn, you're like, I think we're in a good spot. Hopefully we get good scores from, the different teams this week. That'll really put us in a good spot. Every team scored 150 that week or more in FFPC, which is a strong score for people who aren't super familiar with the format. And then since then, like you said, it just continued to crush ultimately. They're all in very good spots, and they're in good spots as rosters and the reason I'm saying this is we've had a couple seasons in the last couple of years where it hasn't been this perfect, but we've continued to preach these ideals. And so I want to emphasize it when it is going the way that it is. But the idea of these rosters is we're not investing a lot of running back capital early. We're understanding that at this point in the season, running back capital doesn't matter anymore in a lot of cases. I mean, essentially, you go look at the running backs, other than Christian McCaffrey, maybe Austin Eckler, whatever. Most of the running backs, it's like it doesn't really matter whether they were drafted early, middle, late. Like there's productive running backs and unproductive running backs. We're at the point in the season where you understand why ADP value isn't super predictive of running back scoring all season long, is what I'm trying to articulate. Meanwhile, at receiver, the guys that are continuing to smash are the good, Tyreek Hill, AJ Brown, Stephon Diggs. I mean, obviously you have like Puka Nacua and stuff, but there are a lot more of the elite receivers playing elite and dominating the top of the leaderboard. You mentioned ETN and Breece Hall, 2 guys we were really in on, and that's a whole nother narrative of the season that I think we want to get into. But I said narrative because what I wanted to say is something that I think has been really interesting with those types of guys, and something that's happened this year is some of the analysis that you and I have been less inclined to believe and have kind of felt was more narrative based and maybe built on small sample evidence. For Breece Hall, it was the return from the ACL. We talked a lot about this in the preseason, that we didn't think that meant that he couldn't have upside. And the payoff was worth the price. And what you're seeing right now is this guy is a guy that anyone who didn't draft him wishes they had. I've seen a lot of people tweet, man, I wish I had Breece Hall. That's a mistake. I'm taking the L on that. And then Travis Etienne, same thing. The preseason usage and some of the stuff, he's not going to play enough on the short yardage. He's not going to catch enough passes. He's not going to be a high-value touch guy, even though his profile is elite. We thought that was a little bit narrative-y. Too much positive in his profile to let him go at the price he was going at. These are things that we've played into some of that type of stuff in the last couple of years, Shawn, and we have to admit that they haven't always gone our way. But the point that we always play into these things is when they go our way, ideally, the hit is big, right? Like the idea is that this is league winning. We've built rosters with these guys on it. that look so much better now than they looked in week one. And that's the point I'm really trying to emphasize here is the way that we're trying to build these teams as they start to crush in the bye weeks. You're also looking at this roster like this is the exact roster I would want to have right now. I would not want to have other players in the early rounds or whatever. Another way that we have framed this or people have framed this is the teams that we build or the ways that we like to build kind of zero running back-y teams, which isn't entirely how we built this year. Obviously targeting some of these dead zone backs that I'm referencing and things like that. But the zero RB-ish philosophy and a lot of depth and not emphasizing the starting lineup and not emphasizing older players who were in roles early in the season. The thing that is often said about that is we are not going to do as well early in the year, right? Like those teams are going to score early. The veterans are going to score and then they're going to probably fall off. We're waiting for rookies to hit. We have this depth that we're waiting to rise to the top. So all I'm trying to say is we are through 8 weeks right now, Shawn, and our teams are in great position. And those were the first 8 weeks. They're set up to be better in the second, 8 or 9 weeks. That doesn't mean they will, but the whole idea is, and this is it coming together. I do think that's very important to emphasize. As you were talking, it wasn't a rant I intended to go on, but as you were talking about how our teams have been doing well, a fun little, idea popped in my head, particularly as it related to Breece Hall and ETN and some of those moments that have been really exciting with them in the last couple of weeks.
And it does go back to this point about really high-end talent and being willing to have some patience. And one of the things that we were actually excited about and sort of emphasizing in terms of getting off to a fast start was the possibility that even though he has had all the injury elements, that J.K. Dobbins might actually be the guy who is extremely undervalued, has the big talent. You obviously see, Gus Edwards score the 3 touchdowns this most recent week. If you had a really high Dobbins exposure, then you're excited for Gus Edwards, who has battled back from his own kind of near career-ending injuries, and is an underdog story. And I think that you want to be very excited for him. There could have been some big Dobbins points there, but even with him kind of going out, one of the things that we tried to do this season was to take advantage of these new running back prices, but take advantage of it in a way that would still potentially allow you to build the wide receiver depth that you would also need, which means this kind of tension or this ability to draft a team where you're willing to take the big risks and you have the discipline to not throw away other picks because you're going to need those, especially as you're taking the risk. So kind of what I mean by that is that we have a variety of teams that are very interesting to me because they're a little bit different than what we would have had in the past when we get to this point where very much you're thinking, okay, there are 0 RB guys who are scoring a ton of points. You could have teams with Zach Moss. You could have teams with Kyron Williams. Hopefully, for people who do have him, he'll be back scoring points, at some time in the year. Obviously, you have Achane. Again, hopefully he'll be back scoring some points. So there are some guys who could do that. But you and I have teams that have both Christian McCaffrey and Travis Etienne, and those are the running back 1 and running back 2 right now. We have teams, obviously, Raheem Mostert would be another guy kind of in that 0 RB mold, but we have teams that have both ETN and Breece Hall. We have teams that have one of those guys with Jonathan Taylor. And so when you're talking about being at this point in the season, being in good position scoring-wise, and then having teams that can get 2 guys from that McCaffrey, ETN, Hall, Jonathan Taylor group, then, you're thinking, okay, we've got 2 guys who could be, in the mix for the 101 next year. Now, probably that's not going to happen. We've talked about all the reasons why. Obviously, guys like Tyreek Hill, Justin Jefferson, even with a little bit of a rough way the season is going, Cooper Kupp, even certainly Jamar Chase, the receivers are going to be very highly coveted. And yet when you think about the running backs that in the past would be very clear-cut top 5 picks, to have not just like the 2 perfect guys, but to have a mix of like 4 players who all really fit that mold of elite running backs, to have them on rosters where you like the other guys. One of the things that's kind of interesting right now, it's been a little bit disappointing, the amount of production we've gotten from Jared Goff and Geno Smith, but we have teams with Tua. That part of it has been awesome, even though I mean, Tua really has, and the Dolphins have left some passing points on the table that, may seem strange for people to think when Tyreek Hill is having this amazing season. But there are ways where Tua could be scoring more points. I guess, Ben, if I would make a prediction, it would be that Tua actually averages more points per game from this point to the end than he has so far. Again, a little bit of a strong take considering what Hill has done, but I think you're going to get more from Waddle. You're going to get more from some of the other guys. You're going to even get these running backs to score points in the receiving game. That part will help. Sam Howell has been a wild ride where he's the QB8, but you might not have played him in some of those games. And then we're also looking to figure out ways in which you might add some people. Ben, obviously the big name this week was Will Levis, but I kind of think that Joshua Dobbs is interesting when you're talking about the rushing value and then him moving into this Minnesota Vikings offense that has pieces. I mean, you're talking about going from a Cardinals team that, Marquise Brown probably pretty good, certainly fast. Rondale, an interesting piece, never has any coaching staff figured out how to use him in a way that makes much difference. Trey McBride, I would like to say an emerging star, maybe a flash in the pan. But you go from that to what the Vikings have, and you go from a team that is playing really hard in the Cardinals, but, is also pointed toward possibly the number one pick, to a Vikings team that is really interesting. There are going to be some ways to score points with those quarterbacks. So the quarterback position has been very interesting. Obviously, you've got Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts still separated. You've got this bounce back season from Justin Herbert, but it's been possible to play without the early QB picks. So, that part and that tension I think is interesting. And then, Ben, the area that we've been just massively hitting and has been a lot of fun is at tight end, where we have a lot of Laporta teams, but we also have teams that are either a Kittle team or a Kyle Pitts team. Maybe the move to Heineke will make that Pitts play really work, especially if, hopefully Drake London is able to go as well. But there's some potential there. And then you've got some guys behind them, like a Trey McBride on some of those teams, to be able to get tight end points. And it's not exclusively one guy this season, so I think that part of it is fun. But when you don't have Travis Kelce really taking the lid off completely, when you don't have Mark Andrews crushing the entire position, now, those guys you would still prefer to have if you didn't have to pay for them, right? They're still the best guys. But what Laporta is doing, that part maybe is the most fun thing that's happened so far. I really like the balance of these teams. And you look at it and you think, you could have a guy have a bad game who's an important player and still go out and win. 2022, one of the things that was just, kind of boring about it was that you got the stars scoring points and then the rest of the guys were very blah. You could have a full team of guys who are fun and interesting and high scoring this season. And in many ways, you need to have that in order to be competitive because of the scoring landscape. I guess I just like fantasy football to be more fun, to have more points scored, and the NFL has been more fun. 2023 is pretty cool.
Yes. Yep. I couldn't agree with all that more. We have the chasing stolen. I was just thinking through, as you were saying, that the Laporta thing is probably my favorite thing because we have him on a lot of spots on these FFPC teams, tight end premium. Obviously, that's fantastic to see. There's another one where we're talking about a point that I want to, I guess, expand on a little bit, where we talk in the off, there's off-season narratives, and they latch on in this industry, and they are the only thing that matters. We've had a lot of conversation about rookie tight end scoring over the years, and that was the only reason that could justify where Laporta was going, because his profile and his situation, they were holding him out of the preseason. They were clearly going to make him a 90% routes guy from week one. It was just obvious. Everyone agreed with that. It was just like, well, historically, rookie tight ends are not doing that well. And you were the one that got me on Laporta. Again, I got to give you a lot of credit here. I'm glad I jumped on that early enough because I ended up with a lot of him as well. But it was like, man, why wouldn't you want to bet on this player, right? Like, why wouldn't anyway, I just pulled up our Chasing Stolen Bananas team with Pat and Pete, the ship chasing guys that I do stuff with every Thursday night on Thursday Night Football, obviously, over on Ship Chasing. That's a team that has Tua and Laporta. And when you have your favorite and best sort of late quarterback hit and best sort of late tight end hit, as you were just talking about, the balance is so fun. This team has McCaffrey and Etienne, right? The running backs are awesome. And then it also has all our traditional receiver depth. We paid a ton to get Puka Nacua onto this roster. It has Waddle, Pickens, Higgins, JSN. It's not as like, it doesn't have an elite first round receiver because we had McCaffrey. But it is a team that has depth and upside, and it's got Wandale Robinson, Traylon Burks, Quentin Johnston, and Marvin Mims. None of those guys, and Jalen Hyatt. I mean, maybe none of those guys are going to hit, but we're definitely pocketing every breakout possibility from here on out, hoping we can find one. In addition to the other, more veteran names that I already mentioned. So there's a lot of upside at receiver, and that team is a great example of the balance that you talked about. I wanted to find one roster where we had both Tua and Laporta, because they're the ones that for me are just, like you said, I mean, are so fun. And you mentioned a lot of players there. The Howell, I think Howell's really coming on. There was something else you mentioned that I'm forgetting. But yeah, I mean, it's very cool to see the way the rosters have come together.
What are your thoughts there on Jonathan Taylor? Obviously, we used an early pick on him in one of our leagues, and everything melted down, within like 72 hours after. That was a little disappointing. And then, he's been dynamic in moments. He was dynamic in that first half on Sunday. And then they had a little bit of a weird deal. Zach Moss has been very, very good, not only in terms of fantasy scoring, where he is the overall running back 4, but his peripherals are also excellent. And some of that has stretched across quarterbacks. So we felt like these running backs were going to be dynamic with Anthony Richardson because of the threat that he has, but also that this offense might be aggressive enough and fast-paced enough that there would be pressure on the defense even when Gardner Minshew is there at QB. And we've seen some of that, and Josh Downs has been somebody who is on some of our teams. And he's not going to be a league winner, but someone who gives you that wide receiver depth. He has played extremely well. Obviously, they have Michael Pittman. And yet this is a weird game where you've got both of those guys, and in part, Moss playing pretty well. They're like, well, we wanted to get him the ball even though we have Taylor. But this game ends with like 19 consecutive Gardner Minshew dropbacks, if I counted correctly. Certainly something in that range, even if I did not. Yeah, you're trailing. You've got some game script elements there. But this seems like a weird one, Ben. Where are we going to go with this Colts team that, the AFC South is awful. And so, we talked a little bit about the Diamondbacks and Major League Baseball when the two of us were just chatting before, and how you never want to throw away a season where you could have made the playoffs because you don't know what's going to happen. I would say even though that football is a one-game scenario as opposed to these series that you get with baseball and basketball and that sort of thing, there is such a gap between teams like the Chiefs and a team like the Indianapolis Colts that, you do want to be building something sustainable. You want to be building for the long term. You're not going to win the Super Bowl with Gardner Minshew. Was it weird that they chased so much in this game, especially because Minshew has not – I wouldn't say he hasn't played well. We know that Minshew can move the ball, and that's something in your backup quarterback. The teams that have a backup quarterback who can move the ball, that's a weapon. And yet most of those guys, they can move the ball, but you're also not going to get mistake-free play. Minshew has not been mistake-free, since he was forced to take over for Anthony Richardson. I guess I'm wanting you to tell me that the Colts are going to give us some massive Jonathan Taylor games over the next 6 weeks.
They are. I'll tell you that. I did remember what I was going to say in the last segment, so I want to say that real quick, and then I'm going to go to Taylor. But the other player was Kyle Pitts, who you had mentioned, among others. Potentially the Heineke thing will improve for him. And I was just going to say that for anyone who was laughing at this mention of, hey, things are going to get better for Kyle Pitts, it feels right now. I always like to emphasize in season the way that things feel after they go right. It feels right now like the Breece Hall breakout was inevitable. Like the Travis Etienne thesis was inevitable. But those guys were going where they were in drafts because that was not inevitable, because there was real risk about Hall's knee. And Javonte Williams, by the way, has looked really good. He's the multi-ligament one. He was going even later. He started to look really good. have a lot of optimism for his potential impact in weeks, double-digit weeks, which we knew would be a little bit of a slower build for him.
Ben, I was so blown away and excited by the Trey McBride emergence that I felt comfortable telling readers to go trade for Ramondre Stevenson this week. I think he is the next one. I mean,
he's the next one.
Yeah.
Where it feels like it can't happen, but that's the point I'm trying to make is with Pitts right in this moment, and I don't even want to say with Ramondre because Ramondre has looked bad, Sean. But that's the thing is like you don't. There is no. I mean, there are risks in these plays. And so, I mean, if your inclination when we bring up Kyle Pitts' name, and if anything, if Kyle Pitts just continues to fail forever, that's what we can be laughed at for continuing to tout Kyle Pitts. That allows us to continue the same exact strategy of targeting all of these types of players next year because it's been the same strategy for like a decade, but nobody wants to do it because they don't want to be the one who has to get laughed at about going after Kyle Pitts 3 years in a row when it doesn't work for that player. And if Kyle Pitts ends up being that player, that's going to be very unfortunate. But some of the other
that Kyle Pitts is not that great a player.
Yeah, I'm getting a little worried about that too. I will readily admit that. But the point I'm trying to make is the feeling you get when you think about Kyle Pitts actually breaking out at this point, how impossible that sounds is similar to the feeling you got of not necessarily exactly the same, but similar to the feeling that people felt, certainly some people, about Breece Hall's ability to play this year after the ACL, about Etienne's ability to be a receiving back and have goal line work, because both of those things felt in jeopardy, about Sam Laporta's ability to be, what is he, the tight end 2 right now? I don't know where he's at, actually. Maybe tight end 3, because Hawkinson's up there. I'm going to pull it up. The tight end 3 overall through 8 weeks of his rookie season ahead of Mark Andrews. No, of course, nobody thought that was not possible. That wasn't possible, except it's happened, right? And so the point is, right now, it feels in hindsight like this was inevitable. We should have known Sam Laporta. I just said that a little bit ago, how glad I was to get on this, and because all the signs were pointing positively. But the point I was trying to make about all these narratives that we believed in the past, and how this has been a season that really emphasizes that you can't always just let one thing be like that red flag that you're going to scratch them off your board, because this has been a season for shattering those types of things. Running backs can't play the year after an ACL. Rookie tight ends can't perform. Travis Etienne, the usage stuff, the preseason usage stuff, and really digging into that kind of stuff, that can't possibly go any other way when we're sitting on the show saying that's what it does. That you have to realize in season things happen differently. Like we talked about this about Josh Jacobs' 2022 season, where people went back in hindsight and said, remember when he played in the Hall of Fame game? And it was like, yeah, I mean, he did play in the Hall of Fame game. That's a real thing that happened. And in week 1, he played his lowest snap share of the season, if I'm not mistaken. He ramped up in season to his full role. And it was like week 4 or whatever that he took off and ended up becoming a really big player for the Raiders last year. It wasn't something that was inevitable from the Hall of Fame game through to week 1. It was something that happened during the year it ramped up. And those other things have happened for other players. You mentioned Jonathan Taylor. He's a great example where we sit right now feels a little bit daunting. What I would say, and the reason I would be optimistic, is 2 reasons. One, I do feel like the last couple of weeks, watching these games, you see a clear difference between Jonathan Taylor and Zach Moss. Zach Moss has been a little banged up. He had a 40-yard run last week where he went through a huge hole, very well blocked play, and basically veered off to the sideline and let somebody kind of run him down and run him out of bounds. A few years back, Sean, we talked about when they were giving Jonathan Taylor touches to other backs in this backfield, the waste of not giving every touch to a player who can make every touch a game-breaking touch, right? Like you're missing opportunities to potentially impact the game. I think pretty quickly, number one, the Colts are going to recognize. I think they're going to keep it a little bit balanced, and Moss has been good. But the ways they've looked to me the last couple of weeks, and I know Moss's peripherals look good as well, I do think we're going to head toward more Taylor because he just looks like you have to give him every touch in the last couple of weeks, vis-a-vis Moss. It looks like an issue. The second thing is...
Well, and you think about like that Jets-Giants game, and if they had run a different play on the one where Breece Hall scores the long touchdown, you're like, you just don't know which play is going to be. And
yes,
yeah, I mean, a 50-yard touchdown is unlikely on every play. But on any given play, if you have that guy who can do it in there, you've got a shot at it. If you give that play to a Dalvin Cook is not a bad player. His ability has not vanished.
You've been picking him up. You've been adding him to a couple of our rosters. I'm like, Sean, what are you doing?
The situation there, even with how well Zach Moss has played, is that you don't know what play you're going to give Zach Moss during the game. If you'd given it to Jonathan Taylor, it would have won you the game. I'm hopeful. That second half was weird, though. I kept checking to see if he was hurt because, I just don't see how that happens if he's not hurt. It's really bizarre.
The second part of it, and it is bizarre, but I don't think they'll do that again. I do think that was weird sequencing to a certain degree. They ran a lot, the drives leading into the Saints scoring a touchdown that pushed the game from 21-20 to 28-20. And they had a quick 3-and-out, and then the Saints had another touchdown. And the fact that they were able to score, the Saints, late third and early fourth, and then the Colts get the ball back and are now down 35-20. And that's when they threw their final, 3 possessions. They threw basically every snap, and the 3-and-out was 3 passes. But it was a thing where, like, if you have a 3-and-out sandwiched by 2 touchdowns and the game goes from 21-20 to feeling like it's out of hand suddenly, you start to chase. And you were asking, are they always going to chase? I think it was a little bit of the Saints being able to execute and score touchdowns on both of those drives back to back with a 3-and-out sandwiched between that pushed them into we got to start throwing and get back in this, because it was a close game up to that point. It was a back and forth game. I had bet on the Colts, and I was very much watching it thinking the Colts are going to win. I was like, they're in control of this. They're doing well. And then those 2 drives, that moment from the third to the fourth quarter really shifted. And from then on, it was like, okay, well, this game's over now. And so they went into comeback mode, garbage time mode. But the second thing I was going to say about the Colts is that Shane Steichen has really, really impressed me. The way that he ran the offense with Anthony Richardson, I thought was fantastic. The best way to get the most you could out of his skill set. And then I think he's done a lot right with Gardner Minshew, who is limited. He's a backup, but he's a backup that can at least support production. And we have a lot in the fantasy community right now, Sean. I don't know if you've been tracking the quarterback injuries while you've been overseas, but it's been bad. At least Gardner Minshew can keep a fantasy offense afloat. I'm not going to criticize Gardner Minshew, but a lot of what they've done from a pace perspective, from game script and game situation and play calling, even this drop back a ton stuff, I actually think made some sense based on where they were at. And after those 2 TD drives that I was just mentioning, I will note they threw every play and scored on that drive, and they cut it to 35-27. And so it worked. And then they tried again the next 2 drives, and it didn't work. The final 2 drives, they end up losing, obviously. But they were chasing, and some of it worked for their passing game at that point. They got immediately criticized for that. I noted in Stealing Signals that Jonathan Taylor played a lot in the second half, but he was out for the one drive that they ran a bunch, and Zach Moss got a bunch of carries, including the 41-yard carry. He was in and ran a lot of routes on all the dropbacks, but Minshew was pushing it downfield. There wasn't a lot of passing to Taylor. I think the pace, the aggressiveness, I think these guys are going to play fun games. They have an indoor stadium for some of the weather stuff that happens late in years. I think you're going to see Jonathan Taylor progress into a larger role, and also that you have to feel really good about this team and this offense for fantasy. And what happened this past week in terms of the really pass-heavy fourth quarter is not what most of their games are going to look like. I'm really excited for Taylor.
Yeah, when you have that level of talent in an offense that is calling plays and attacking drives with intention, that part is exciting. One of the things that has happened with the Falcons, and one of the things that led to this QB change, is that even though we all know what Arthur Smith is about, they had really spiraled into a situation where they don't have an offensive identity, even though they want it to be the running game. One of the things that was bizarre about week 8 is that you have a team with Andy Reid as the head coach and Patrick Mahomes as the quarterback that does not have an offensive identity. And I think that when you're talking about the defending Super Bowl champions, you're talking about Patrick Mahomes, it's almost impossible to get to the point where that team doesn't have an identity. What identity they do have is really based around their defense at this point. I think they will be interesting to track. We have a ton of Rashee Rice, and he's not a headliner in the way a lot of the other guys that we've discussed today on the show are. And yet I'm excited about him. And I do think that even though this game with the Broncos was a step back for the whole team, it's just really one of these outlier types of games. You have them now playing in Germany. Having done some international travel myself, I'm not excited for what that's going to do to the health and bodies of any of those players. So, some weirdness there. And yet, it almost couldn't break better for him with a situation now that Kadarius Toney experiment has failed. One of the things I'm kind of glad that I sort of missed, at least for a day or two, was them somehow now having McCole Hardman back on the team. He manages to muff up in that game. Got McCole back.
You say that as a Chiefs fan.
I have no idea what they're doing there. Ben, maybe one of the saddest things, because we don't have our season built in any way, shape, or form around Sky Moore this year, but that has just been like a Greek tragedy, right?
Yeah.
He has a play in this last game in a crucial moment where he gets open behind the defense for a touchdown. Ben, Sky Moore cannot drop balls because he can't get his hands close enough to the ball, even when it's on him, for it to count as a drop. I don't think I've really ever seen anything like it. So that part has been demoralizing. On the opposite side of the ball, Jerry Jeudy can't play. Cortland Sutton,
I've never seen anything
weird.
like it.
Marvin Mims evidently doesn't factor into the equation, but you've been writing about it over at Stealing Signals. We had a discussion about it when Jaleel McLaughlin was the big pickup. He has looked good, and yet we talked about some of these real headliners at running back. You mentioned Javonte Williams. He has started to look really good. Are we going to see actually the Denver Broncos as being a team that is a real team, not just a powerhouse, but factors into the AFC playoff picture, even if it's just as a spoiler over the second half here? Really, the week 8 could not, for two teams that have been hugely disappointing, in the Broncos and the Raiders, week 8 gave the Broncos some life and gave the Sean Payton tenure, I think, some enthusiasm, whereas obviously Josh McDaniels, gets fired. But again, there are some things with the Raiders that I feel like I've never seen before either. But, Javonte Williams, he looks like a guy who could be not necessarily Alvin Kamara, but could be a big impact player and does have enough roundedness to his game to help them across the board, even when they can't get their receivers involved.
I agree with all of that. I'm not going to give you the same optimism that I just did with the Colts, though. This is I feel like Sean Payton's running the clock out on the season. He has already cut Russell Wilson in his mind. We've talked about the decision they have on the 5th day of the league year next year. I don't think Russell. They and Wilson's will sort of play along, but they don't. Whether they don't allow him to, or he's not doing it, or the offensive structure, whatever. He's not throwing the ball down the field. This was the most ridiculous win. And the Chiefs lost the game. They turned the ball over 5 times. The Broncos completed 12 passes all game, and 7 of those went to their running backs, who each caught at least 2 passes. Their entire wide receiver and tight end group combined for 5 receptions. Cortland Sutton had 2. Jerry Jeudy had 2. Marvin Mims had 1. I'm at the point where I'm actually ready to cut Marvin Mims, even though I think he's going to be a star in redraft, because even if he gets into the Jerry Jeudy or Cortland Sutton role, these guys are already playing a ton of snaps, and they can't even catch more than 2 balls in a game where the team wins, because they are. It's a gimmick. And you talked about it in the offseason that you thought this offense would be very focused on the running backs. I didn't really understand that. And even when we picked up Jaleel McLaughlin that week, I wasn't as into that pickup or had the opportunity to. We didn't actually get him in a lot of leagues because we spent so much on Puka Nacua in most of our teams, which is part of the reason that our rosters are in good shape right now. Is that helped us in the first few weeks. I guess that does need to be noted. But the McLaughlin play and how it was going to work out, part of your optimism was you thought that this would be a very running back focused team and the expected points for the running back position are going to be high, et cetera. And I do think that's going to be the case. And I hope that will work out well for Javonte Williams, whose snap share up over 60% this past week. I do want to award a caution on Williams. He's not running enough routes, a little bit of a concern. He's very clearly their lead runner. They end up with 32 running back rush attempts in this game. He gets 27 of those 32. That's a massive number. The receiving stuff, far more split. So they were in that situation where they wanted to run a ton, and he was their guy. He's going to be their heavy runner, which can be a little bit of a problem sometimes, right? Because you're just sometimes racking up low-value touches. You can look good and not actually score a ton. But he would presumably get goal line work. The problem is, can the offense actually score a lot of points? I'm again, 5 takeaways in this game, and they still only, it's not like they get all these extra opportunities on offense. They have 240 yards of offense. They have 87 net passing yards. I mean, this is like, be real. Like, this is an unserious football team. And I do think it's Sean Payton saying, look, I don't want Russell Wilson to look good enough to make it hard to cut him. Right. So like in some situations, we talk about the uncertainty of the season and the ways that things can play out. And you just talked about Taylor Heineke taking over quarterback might actually make the Atlanta passing game vaguely interesting. That's something that felt impossible a couple weeks ago, but things can happen that at least make you have a little bit of optimism. My concern with the Broncos is I don't think Russell Wilson's playing bad enough that you can justify benching him at any point, but I also don't think that they have any reason to actually go for it, because then they get in a problem of the decisions in the offseason. And I think the way Peyton's been playing it and the way that he's been sort of forcing everything through the running backs and not actually letting Wilson go downfield a lot does sort of speak to, we want to win a certain type of way because we don't want to complicate this offseason decision. They win in this game to go to 3-5. So by the way, they were 2-5 coming in. If this sounds like it's too early in the season for them to have been packing it in, I don't actually think that. And this win brings them to 3-5, but not really in contention because it is the more difficult conference by a lot. There are better teams in the AFC. Every team in the AFC North has a winning division, a winning record right now. They're tied with the Raiders, who just fired their coach and completely closed up shop. There's 3 teams in the AFC East that have winning records, including the Jets, who, they have another Greek tragedy of a quarterback situation there. But there are enough good teams, enough games, like multiple games ahead of Denver, that I don't think they're actually going to get any false hope about serious contention. Now they are going into the bye, and one of the things is like, coming out of the bye, things can be different, and I might be completely wrong on this, but my mindset right now is a lot of pessimism around that team.
Ben, I had mentioned briefly the situation with Tua, the situation with Sam Howell. We would have loved to have seen the backup quarterback there, Jacoby Brissett, get traded just to make it even a little bit clearer. But I guess I don't see, even with how poorly he's played in some of the games, I don't see how they could ever go away from the guy who played the way Howell played in Week 8 against the Philadelphia Eagles. He's the QB8 right now. That doesn't necessarily reflect where he is in reality, and yet I do think that him as a top 10 quarterback at some point in the future is very much a reality possibility. I think you've got to get every moment of experience you can for him going forward. Tua is the QB4. I mentioned that I think he could score more points in the future. One of the things that is, I think, provocative, controversial, interesting about these QBs is that you have Tua at 4. He was one of our highest targets. Howell at 8, one of our highest targets. Purdy at 9, one of the guys that we wanted to add a lot late. Certainly some other names that we liked, like Kenny Pickett, that's completely and totally exploded. I had mentioned to people that I thought Desmond Ridder is somebody you should add for free and see if things develop there with his weapons and with the potential scrambling ability. That has completely and totally melted down, obviously. So it's not like the QB position has been a clean run for us, but what you're looking to do across these teams is to create upside at good prices. Not just get scoring, but get good scoring you don't have to pay completely for, and to structure your teams in a way that all of the misses don't hurt you. I talked a lot about, draft a bunch of guys late because you don't know for sure. You can feel pretty strongly about someone like a Sam Howell, but there's probably a universe out there where a couple additional plays went poorly and he's no longer the starter, even though he looks like a star. You don't know ahead of time if that's, how that's going to go. So I really like where we are at QB, but some of those QBs I think are interesting in terms of Tua. Where are we now in terms of getting Jalen Waddle? One of the things that really stood out to me this last week is that Jalen Waddle finally has a game from a scoring perspective, from a fantasy perspective, that if you drafted him a lot in round 2 like we did, you feel a little better about, some more of those games are coming. But then there were 3 balls in that game that I just think a good receiver has to catch on top of what he did. And you could even see kind of Tua, who is very much this sort of stoic leader and just good teammate. I mean, you could almost see him there being like, man, if I get a choice between Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle, I'm going to throw the guy who doesn't drop the ball all the time. Yeah. And so you got a little bit of that right there. Obviously, with Howell, you have the breakout game for Jahan Dotson, and then you get the weird replay review late. You also have Terry McLaurin. Now, these aren't like clear-cut drops, and they weren't the best thrown balls that Howell had in that game by any stretch. They were some of the weaker throws. But McLaurin fails to make 2 catches that a good receiver has to make at the end of that game, costing him a chance to get the big signature upset against the Eagles. I think that part was interesting. Certainly now that you have the QB change with the Falcons. So across these teams, are there big moments, big plays, or big shifts that we're going to see going forward? What are you seeing in the future as maybe the most important out of those 3-4 guys, those 3-4 teams?
Well, yeah, there's a couple really interesting things there. And one of the things that we probably don't have time to get into today, but I mentioned it in a recent Stealing Signals, and we need to explore going forward. But it's something that, I spent a lot of the show talking about all of these things that we got right, that we could argue that we kind of got a little bit wrong. I have spent a lot of time saying that it's wrong to think about like number 1 receivers as number 1s, and how some of these teams have 2 number 1s. But one of the things with Waddle, and I think it's true with Devonta Smith and AJ Brown this year, is we have seen the number 1 assert themselves more. And one of the pieces of data that I've seen recently, I'll give a shout out to a former CBS colleague, Jacob Gibbs, who's done a really good job with a lot of data on Twitter. Or on X, whatever you call it. I don't have that right in front of me, but I know he was a part of a conversation. I can't remember exactly where it started, but it was essentially splitting up the production between 2 high and 1 high looks, right? And so then he had, I think, from some data provider, open field, closed middle of the field, what have you. And it was like yards per out run data on those 2 sets. And on 2 highs, it was very balanced. On single high looks, you had a massive gap between Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. You had a massive gap between AJ Brown and Devonta Smith, and several other clear number 1 situations. I think Jamar Chase and T. Higgins also fits, where I think the ways that, the offenses are evolving, and we've talked about this in the macro about the ways that offenses and defense are push and pull and all these things. The 2 high coverage shell, et cetera, that we've talked about being a real challenge to passing games. The way that it's evolving is when offenses can get the defenses into a single high, it does feel like the quarterbacks are going to their superstar number 1s at a really high rate in those situations. They're saying, I have Jamar Chase, I have AJ Brown, I have Tyreek Hill. It might even be the case in Washington. I have Terry McLaurin, and it has meant that these number 2s are more like number 2s. They're being used a little bit more situationally. You talked about Jalen Waddle missing some of those opportunities. I do think there's some data that suggests that it's not just like these number 2s aren't playing well enough. It's that the number 1s are sort of ingrained in a role that when they get certain looks. I also wrote about with Miami and Philly this offseason, the RPO offenses and how those can be more concentrated. And I think that's probably part of it as well, where some of the targets are, the throws are happening on the RPO because of maybe a single high look or something, right? So that it becomes a throw. The safety comes down in the box, they throw the ball. I don't know exactly what their reads are and those types of things, but the RPO design is either a handoff or a throw to one specific guy, and it can't be a progression because then you get an eligible man downfield. The offensive linemen are run blocking. For anyone who doesn't remember all that discussion, we talked about a lot in the offseason. But essentially the idea is it's either a run play or a target to a specific player that is the pass part of the run pass option RPO. And so I do think there's probably an element there which plays in, which Miami Philly, two of the teams that when I wrote about RPOs this offseason, I focused on a ton because those were two of the biggest RPO offenses in the league. But it is interesting, and it is something that I want to look more into. I don't have a lot of great answers on it, but it does seem to be the case. The ways that defenses are playing now is actually shifting us back toward. We talked for a few years there, Sean, when we went to 3 wide receiver sets and more open offenses, and when the shotgun rate exploded and more receivers were getting on the field, that we weren't getting elite number one usage the way we used to. Because we used to always say, hey, remember when Brandon Marshall had that 40% target share year? Remember when, Julio Jones and Calvin Johnson had 200 target seasons? That's not happening anymore, right? Well, we're kind of shifting back, it seems, based on the ways that defenses shut down some things and offenses have had to counter. We're still in a lot of shotgun, 3 wide sets, but it's more situational about like where the ball is going to go, like based on what the defense is showing. Obviously, defenses are rolling coverages is a big part of it. And there must be something here. I don't know what it is. I'm excited to talk more about it and think more about it and look more into it. But something here that is actually funneling more targets towards the number ones in these offenses, which then does, counter the point that I always made, which was like, yeah, I mean, these guys are running routes together. They're both number ones. Jamar Chase and Higgins are both number ones. Yeah, Chase is better, but like Higgins is really good in his own right. He has an opportunity to earn targets. I think there's a lot of these situations where the number 2 doesn't really have an opportunity to earn the target, whether it's an RPO, whether it's a defensive look, what have you. It's going to Tyreek Hill as opposed to Waddle. And I do think that's going to shift our perception of the gap between number 1s and number 2s in various offenses, or maybe already should have. And maybe that continues to rotate. Maybe the next step of that is that they have to do some of that with their number 2s and incorporate their number 2s more. I don't know. We're early stages, right? But Tyreek Hill, fastest player in NFL history to 1,000 yards, 8 games. A.J. Brown, not far behind him, has added 30 yards per game to his yards per game total from last year in his first year with the Eagles, which was a career high for him. And Tyreek Hill's was a career high for him, I believe. And he's at a 25 or so yards per game. They are in the top 7, A.J. Brown and Tyreek Hill, all time in receiving yards per game right now as we currently sit. They could go on to absolutely historic seasons. They've consolidated stuff in a way that I didn't think was possible with Devonta Smith and Jalen Waddle in those offenses. And the reasons why for that maybe are a lot more complex than I just said, but those are some initial things that I've seen that I think are very interesting.
And I think as we get the push and pull, one of the things that we'll be looking for, certainly if you got a lot of Smith and Waddle in the middle to late second round, we could still see that pull back in the second half. Looking at the numbers, as you mentioned, absolutely extraordinary. Tyreek Hill having this historic start, and yet, your guy, A.J. Brown, he's got like 100 more air yards even than Tyreek Hill. The usage there for him. Then there are 4 players who right now have a 33% target share. And, on more of a full season, Cooper Kupp does as well, but it's only played the 4 games. And it really reinforces that if you have a 33% target share, there's no way you can be anything other than a high-end wide receiver 1. Obviously, you've got Stephon Diggs, Tyreek Hill, Jamar Chase, and Garrett Wilson, right? 460-some yards, 2 touchdowns.
Isn't that so frustrating? He would be absolutely smashing, Sean. There's nothing I'm more confident in than that Garrett Wilson, the process was correct. If Aaron Rodgers doesn't tear his Achilles on the first freaking snaps of the year, we would have way more evidence. Even if he played 3 games, I think those would have been 3 monster Garrett Wilson games, and then tore his Achilles. Rodgers tears his Achilles. I think we would have all been very comfortable saying, man, Garrett Wilson got screwed. He was going to have a monster season. Unfortunately, we don't have the production to back it up, but he's earning volume in the way that you would expect him to. Zach Wilson continues to be really bad. I know there are people that are like, yeah, they're doing okay. They're winning some games. He's bad. He's really bad. I'm sorry. Like I've said it a lot over the last couple of years, but he missed a 3rd and 2 pass on a flat route to Breece Hall that you just have to have. He throws it at his kneecaps. It's such an easy rollout pass. It was one that I wrote up, I know, last week for Stealing Signals. There's several plays, though. I can't think of all of them. But one of the things, Sean, you mentioned about the Jacoby Brissett trade that I just have thought a lot about this year is it's just so unfortunate. You want a hot take? We need backup quarterbacks to be in like some pool where teams can like bid on them like free agent budget money somehow. It is so unfair to us as football fans and as fantasy fans and to the quarterbacks themselves that quarterbacks are going to get hurt. The ones that get hurt, we don't get to always have the best backup on that roster, right? So you have Gardner Minshew as one I was talking about as a positive. And Anthony Richardson looked like a guy who could have been a star this year in fantasy. And some of the quarterback stuff you're talking about has been so, hammered by these injuries by players like him. But you have Minshew there. That's a positive. But in so many other spots, we don't have guys. I was talking to some people that I was excited that Tyrod Taylor got another opportunity, and then he gets hurt as well. But to have Brissett, like you said, in Washington, to have Andy Dalton, who looked good in his opportunity with the Panthers, he's a name that got floated as a potential trade candidate, maybe to Minnesota, right? We did get Joshua Dobbs moved around a couple times at the end of training camp and then now to go play where there was an opening. But to have those guys in spots where, we're sending out Zach Wilson, for example, and we can't, just get Andy Dalton to the Jets somehow, right? Or Jameis Winston, people talked about. I don't even want to watch Jameis Winston anymore, but I do know he's going to chuck the ball around and players are going to be able to catch the ball. It's not, whatever. There's got to be some way for us to get these quarterbacks that have to sign on as backup somewhere into the available opportunities for the whole league's sake. Can we turn into a socialistic backup quarterback situation? I'm ready to vote.
It's been bizarre too, because if you had told me that the Jets would play this well otherwise and would not figure something out at quarterback, I would simply not have believed you, because you've got PJ Walker, who basically is giving the Browns like everything that Deshaun Watson was giving them. You have Tyrod Taylor before he very sadly gets hurt again, giving the Giants everything that Daniel Jones was giving them. You have, as you mentioned, Joshua Dobbs, which when you contrast where the Vikings are and the push that they made, even though in some ways it would make some sense for them to take a step back and contrast that with what the Jets have done there. There are a lot of different situations like this around the NFL where the backups have done some very interesting things. Andy Dalton was fantastic in his appearance. There are guys available. And one of the things that I did wonder a little bit about, and I think that probably because, his best game again came just the most recently, it makes it a little bit harder, but there had to have been points in time this year where the Commanders were a little bit uncertain what they were going to do. You could very clearly have pried not just Jacoby Brissett away, but you could have gotten Sam Howell. And you imagine Sam Howell there with Garrett Wilson. I just have some guts. Do what it takes to make some of these plays. And one of the things that we witnessed with the Commanders giving away some of their other players is that, you can get big names for picks that aren't that big a deal. If there's any kind of, salary issue or future issue, if there's any kind of question mark, you've got to be aggressive. The teams that, let the 49ers go out and add more talent to their roster. The 49ers we're just going to go ahead and draft weird guys every draft because we can use other picks to take other people's best players for nothing. So why wouldn't we just do that?
Yeah. And then they just let all these free agents walk. The pick they sent for Chase Young is one of their projected compensatory picks, which I think they're projected to have 3 third-round compensatory picks, and they sent one of those. So it's an after the third round compensatory pick. It's going to be about pick 100 or something like that. The Bears, by contrast, sent a second-round pick to get Montez Sweat, the other Commanders' D-end. Theirs is going to be like a top 5 pick in the second round. And you're talking about a massive gap between those two. And that's what the Bears do, and that's what the 49ers do.
So an interesting trade deadline, an exciting last several weeks. Then it's so fun to be back with you. We hope that the listeners are having similar results. We know that obviously not every league is going perfectly, but usually our portfolios act as a somewhat one-to-one proxy with the portfolios of listeners. And so 2023 really moving in the direction of a fun fantasy season for the Stealing Bananas community. We love you guys. It's great to be back with you. I'm Shawn Siegele. With me as always is Ben Gretch. You can follow at @YardsPerGretch. Make sure you sign up for Stealing Signals. Make sure you sign up for Stealing Lines, the betting project there with Dalton Cates. Make sure you sign up for Stealing Signals Gold and get your chance to interact with Ben. we'd love to have you guys over there at RotoViz. I love what some of our young writers are doing. I love what Curtis and Dave and Blair are doing with their signature pieces. I'm obviously super biased, but it was so much fun to write my articles this week and explore the data that we have in the tools. I think the tools are worth the price of the subscription. Again, I'm biased. Leave us a rating and review. We love you guys. We'll talk to you soon.